During the early days of the COVID crisis, the rush to do something created a crisis of its own.
What was your first clue that there was going to be a large element of fraud possible?
As soon as we started to hear what the numbers were in terms of how much money was going to be allocated to these programs.
This week, we follow the money with trillions of tax dollars spent and stolen.
If you've been going grocery shopping lately, you may have noticed the newest luxury item on the American menu, beef.
Are you getting more money for your cattle?
No, we're not.
Prices at the supermarket keep rising, but that profit isn't being seen down on the range. The reason might surprise you.
And we're in Jerusalem, the ancient and divided city. A second American administration trying to put a diplomatic mission there has hit a hard Israeli wall.
What does that mean? No way. But if Biden's administration insists on it.
I want to make it very clear. We oppose it.
Welcome to Full Measure. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. Whether it's helping businesses, supporting hospitals and schools, or paying the unemployed, a record amount of money is being spent on COVID-19 related assistance in the U.S. But for every taxpayer dollar that's sent to someone who needs it, an unknown amount of money is lost to waste and fraud. Today we look at some of the biggest cons so far and who's looking for all the crooks.
Texas businessman Dinesh Saw is one of the biggest known COVID scamsters so far. He's sentenced to 11 years in prison for fabricating documents applying for nearly $25 million for non-existent businesses and workers. He spent the taxpayer money on homes and luxury cars.
What was your first clue that there was going to be a large element of fraud possible?
As soon as we started to hear what the numbers were in terms of how much money was going to be allocated to these programs.
Mike Ware is the Inspector General of the Small Business Administration, which is in charge of administering COVID-19 relief for businesses. With Ware's help, we're taking a deep dive into all the fraud that's come with it.
Immediately, we knew it because we had a large body of previous work that we had conducted over decades.
$6.2 trillion. I've never signed anything with a T on it.
The amount of COVID funds pouring into the U.S. economy is mind-boggling. March 6, 2020, $8.3 billion tax dollars for vaccines and testing, followed by $225 billion for testing, sick leave, and food aid. $2.2 trillion, including stimulus payments, expanded unemployment benefits, and the Paycheck Protection Program. $483 billion more for the Paycheck Protection Program and COVID testing. $920 billion, including stimulus payments, billions more for the Paycheck Protection Program, vaccines, schools, and unemployment. And $1.9 trillion, including more stimulus payments and more money for schools and vaccines. That's about $6 trillion to date, far bigger than the entire economies, the total of all goods and services produced of nearly every nation on the planet. The incredible sums of money were rushed out the door, say watchdogs, without proper oversight in place. Ware says the Small Business Administration quickly got flooded with applications.
What happened was, from the onset, they were doing batch processing. So, I think it was like 17 minutes an officer had to review a file in order to meet these things, because the batches were coming in 200 at a time. And that was one of the schemes we noticed when we started to track what the fraudsters were actually saying. Bombard them, throw as many at the wall as possible, and some will get through.
Do you dream of owning your own small business? We can help.
Suspicious patterns, such as hundreds of loan applications from the same internet address, merited follow-up, he says, but efforts to implement controls were met with resistance by leadership at the Small Business Administration, or SBA.
What we do know is this. From the onset, they didn't take that seriously. So it was, but it could be a reason why. There could be a viable reason why. Our role here is to get this money out.
Who's saying that?
So the leadership at SBA at the time. So it's like, they're red flags. And I need you to flag those loans and do the due diligence to make sure that they're going to the people who are eligible to receive them.
One early hint of the staggering scale of crime came as the Inspector General's hotline quickly surged from 900 complaints in a year pre-COVID to 155,000 in 2020.
This is more than we've ever had total. And what has been incredibly helpful to us is, hey, our employer got this money and he bought a car and he bought a house and he bought this and we have not been paid. And that's the type of things, when we triage this information, that's what we're going after immediately.
So far, the Justice Department has charged more than 750 people in fraud cases involving $614 million. But auditors assume most criminals are never caught, and there are as many scenarios as there are fraudsters. Virginia Smith pleaded guilty to fraudulently getting unemployment benefits for at least 22 prison inmates. Eric Ahikpour admitted stealing COVID relief funds to buy boats while awaiting trial for a multi-million-dollar internet romance scam. Sheila Dunlap allegedly conspired with her son, who is in prison, to get the ID information of 9,000 people to illegally claim payments for almost $145,000. Andrew Tesna, a senior NASA executive and Colombia native, was sent to prison after spending nearly $300,000 in COVID relief money on a $6,000 French bulldog, a $50,000 swimming pool loan, and 6 figures worth of personal debt, all while Tesna earned more than $180,000 a year helping oversee finances at NASA. Dana McIntyre is accused of falsely claiming he employed almost 50 people at his pizza shop. He got more than $500,000 in tax money, sold the restaurant, and prosecutors say went on a spending spree that included cars and an alpaca farm. 5 Venezuelans allegedly used fake IDs to steal $800,000 in COVID-19 relief checks. A Florida couple was convicted in a $1.1 million fraud scheme. They got taxpayer money for their farms, 2 businesses, and 62 employees, none of which existed. One giveaway should have been that the land they claimed to be farming was in the yards of 2 small urban Miami homes. Leibniz Tran is charged with stealing $3.6 million in taxpayer funds, using some of it to buy cryptocurrency and a $100,000 Tesla. Michael Lane admitted submitting 70 fraudulent loan applications in a $4 million scheme. Azhar Sarwar Rana pleaded guilty to more than $5 million in fraud, buying stocks, paying luxury car expenses, and sending hundreds of thousands of dollars to his home country of Pakistan. Engineer Shashank Rai admitted to a $13 million scheme, claiming 250 employees when he had none. Chinese national Muj Ma pleaded guilty in a $20 million COVID relief money fraud scheme. And Hassan Hakim Brown admitted to working with co-conspirators to steal $24 million in COVID-19 relief funds.
You published a flash report in May which resulted in legislative changes. It said based on prior work and analysis of loan data, you identified at the time 70,835 loans, $4.6 billion in potentially fraudulent PPP loans. That's a huge number, $4.6 billion.
Yeah, it's a huge number. And that's the way I look at it. I look at it straight up at numbers. Other people like to dissect it. Well, it's only X amount of percent of the pool. And I say, what is $4.6 billion? And it was the banks up front who were partnering with us from the onset to say, hey, we have a problem. These deposits are going into their accounts from the Economic Injury Disaster Loans, EIDL program, where these people never had a business. We asked them a simple question. You're a business owner? No. It's because it was up to $10,000 at the time. So
and they have to have owned a business to get the loan, supposedly.
They owned a business. They should have had employees as well to get the $10,000 because of SBA's rules, proving that you had at least 10 people. And they were, well, what is this money for? And folks weren't able to even say what the money was for. We were just told the government was giving out money.
In terms of perspective, similar tales of con artistry have emerged after every giant sum of federal taxpayer money has left the Treasury. There was the banker who admitted spending $381,000 in bank bailout funds to buy a waterfront condo in Florida. The SAT tutor sent to prison in a $3 million swindle of stimulus funds given under President Obama's Recovery Act. And a reported $1 billion in relief fraud after Hurricane Katrina, with taxpayer money spent on diamonds, porn videos, and Hawaiian vacations. Congress could put permanent safeguards in place that automatically activate when emergency money goes out the door, Ware says, but no such measure is being considered, ensuring there will be lots to keep prosecutors and the Inspector General busy in the foreseeable future.
The employees of the Small Business Administration worked hard to get the money out to people who needed it so desperately. But the balance to be struck between the speed of that and a control environment that ensures it goes to the people who really need it and who are eligible, that balance was just a little bit off center, but it's something that is really being focused on currently.
You may wonder how much money investigators are able to get back from the fraudsters they catch. That varies widely. When I interviewed Ware, he said the Small Business Administration had recovered about $1.9 billion. Next on Full Measure, why the high price of beef isn't helping American cattle ranchers. If you've been to the supermarket lately, you've probably noticed the price of meat is going up and fast. But while the price you pay has never been higher, many American cattle ranchers say they're struggling. We sent Lisa Fletcher to Oklahoma to find out why.
When it comes time to feed this prized Angus herd, a simple tap of the truck horn gets an immediate response. But feeding the cattle is perhaps the only easy part of the business for John Pfeiffer, who's been farming here in central Oklahoma since 1985. His family has been in the state for generations.
My granddad talks about when he went through the 30s, and they were actually getting paid $10 a head for the cows to kill them because there wasn't any market for them.
Things are better than they were for John's granddad, but much in his business depends on factors ranchers can't control, like the price of feed or how much they can sell their animals for.
It's always been difficult for farmers to make a living. They've always talked about the fact that they're asset rich and cash poor.
And right now, there's a strange contradiction in the beef business. While prices at the supermarket keep rising, many of those who raise the cattle aren't seeing higher profits. Are you getting more money for your cattle?
No, we're not.
For more than a decade, retail prices of beef have been steadily rising, going from $6.81 to $12.28 per pound for sirloin steak between 2011 and now. Over the same time, the price for live cattle has stayed flat, between $120 and $160 per hundredweight.
We can adjust to the situation.
Fred Stokes is also a cattleman. After a 20-year military career, he returned to his family farm in Mississippi. When we caught up with him this summer, he was in Washington, D.C. with fellow farmers, discussing what's wrong with the cattle business and meeting members of Congress. What are family farmers up against right now?
Extinction, probably.
Who's getting all the money?
Right now, the beef packer. They're totally ripping people off.
Stokes helped found a farmers group called the Organization for Competitive Markets. It says the U.S. beef industry has become too concentrated, with just 4 meatpacking companies controlling more than 80% of the market.
There's no question that they have the leverage to exact whatever they want, whatever portion they want from the beef dollar. Between them and the retailer, they take so much off the plate that there's simply not enough on average for the producer to get by.
The price livestock producers received plummeted while consumer prices surged.
And it's not just smaller ranchers sounding the alarm. The vice president of the U.S. Cattlemen's Association recently said this at a meeting of the Senate Agriculture Committee.
But since 2015, corporate packers' gross margin has ballooned from an average of $100 to $200 a head to well over $1,000 a head. Packers have enjoyed unbelievable profits, harvesting around 120,000 head per day, while cattle producers go out of business and consumers pay double or even triple at the meat counter.
Of the 4 big meat-packing companies, 2 are Brazilian-controlled. A trade group that represents them has accused the government of scapegoating them, saying low prices for cattle ranchers are a result of market forces, with more animals than existing production plants can handle, creating a buyer's market for live cattle. For consumers, it all means higher prices now and in the future. And because of loopholes in labeling rules, it isn't even clear where the beef is coming from.
Fun to have USDA come yesterday. And
Mike Eby is a 7th-generation dairy farmer and cattle rancher from Pennsylvania. Explain to people who don't know, why is country of origin labeling so important to an American farmer?
Here you have beef that is brought in from other countries, maybe blended with the American beef, repackaged once it gets here, and they can then slap a made in the USA on it because it's, in a styrofoam container that is, it's made in the USA. So to the consumer that's purchasing, they just assume that it is in the U.S. and there is no differentiation between beef that is brought in from other countries such as Brazil.
Except for the price. Often making foreign beef because it costs less the choice of Americans who think they're supporting U.S. farmers because there's no requirement to tell consumers the true country of origin.
Come on.
Farmers like John say they are holding on as best they can, watching their profits disappear, and quite possibly their family farms along with them.
And so what is the Biden administration saying about this?
Well, they've accused the 4 major meatpacking companies of, quote, pandemic profiteering for near-record profits. The U.S. Department of Agriculture says it's looking at ways of addressing the problem. Some members of Congress are looking toward legislation for more price transparency. Even the Department of Justice is looking into this. And meanwhile, there are some cattle ranchers that are trying to raise money to start their own processing plants.
And meantime, the prices
keep going up.
Thanks, Lisa. Ahead on Full Measure, a disputed holy city and America's changing role there. When President Trump relocated the U.S. Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, Israeli Jews considered it a big win, while Muslim Palestinians saw it as a snub. Now, more than 3 years later, President Biden is making his own mark, reshaping America's role. Scott Thuman reports from Israel.
In Jerusalem, not far from the Wailing Wall and the site of the tomb of Jesus, an empty dirt lot has become the epicenter of an international argument that took a chaotic turn nearly 4 years ago when then President Trump announced something that instantly reversed decades of U.S. foreign policy.
Today, we finally acknowledge the obvious, that Jerusalem is Israel's capital.
At the time, no other country in the world had made such a declaration. And from Gaza to the gates of the old city, it set off a firestorm of violent protests by Palestinians who, like the Israelis, claimed Jerusalem as their capital, their sovereignty blocked by an American and Jewish alliance. More than 3 years later, Israelis we spoke to had mixed reaction. How long have people in Israel been talking about the embassy moving from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem?
5 years, maybe.
Long time.
Long time.
I think, we are happy with this decision that Trump made. And we hope that the new administration will keep it,
Preliminary actions were mostly symbolic, transferring some staff and services from the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv, located in this building since the 1960s, into temporary space at this building, an already existing U.S. consulate office in Jerusalem. With the location of a permanent embassy not yet determined, it was a move then presidential candidate Joe Biden initially criticized from the campaign trail in Boston, saying, quote, "It should not have been moved." The candidate became president, but Anthony Blinken, then a nominee for Secretary of State, affirmed the Trump move at his own Senate confirmation hearing.
Do you agree that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel? And do you commit that the United States will keep our embassy in Jerusalem?
Yes and yes.
Though in recent days, desire to make another bold move surfacing, the president dispatching his now confirmed secretary to announce a matter likely to keep tensions in the region high: the reopening of a diplomatic compound, an American consulate located in a part of Jerusalem considered Palestinian territory.
We'll be moving forward with the process of opening a consulate as part of deepening those ties with the Palestinians.
When I sat down this summer with Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh in their capital of Ramallah, located about an hour north of Jerusalem, he applauded the effort by the Biden administration to reestablish diplomatic ties inside the West Bank territory claimed by Palestinians, ties that may one day reopen peace talks between Israel, Palestine, and the U.S.
That's important to us because we consider American consulate in East Jerusalem as a nuclear for a future American embassy to Palestine, and that's the real value for us.
Dr. Michael Milstein is former head of the Israeli military's Department for Palestinian Affairs.
Here in Israel, we are in a very complex situation with a government that combines right and left, and maybe the response of the Israeli government for this move will be, maybe it will be a negative one.
Israel's Justice Minister Gideon Sa'ar proclaimed at the annual Jerusalem Post Conference the reopening of the U.S. diplomatic facility for Palestinians in Jerusalem will never happen.
I want to make it very clear. We oppose it. We don't oppose it now, and we will have a different opinion after the budget. We are 100% oppose that.
Meanwhile, there's ongoing debate over what's next. The State Department tells us a separate new U.S. embassy will replace the temporary setup in the same area of Jerusalem, but won't say exactly where, only that it will reflect the depth and breadth of the U.S. relationship with Israel. In a land where occupying disputed space claimed by two populations almost always has ramifications, it may make finding common ground even more elusive. For Full Measure, I'm Scott Thuman in Jerusalem.
When we return, a look at what's ahead next week on Full Measure. Coming up next week on Full Measure, we're off to Puerto Rico. A record amount of tax money has gone to the U.S. territory after hurricanes, and that's brought untold amounts of fraud in a place known for corruption. An update on some of the big cases next week on Full Measure. Until then, thanks for watching. We'll be searching for more stories that hold powers accountable.